Hi guys. Today what I'd like to talk to you about is the circulatory system. Now we've been spending some time over the last few days looking at the respiratory system and our digestive system. And after all, these things, the respiratory system and the digestive system, are taking in substances that our body needs. We're taking in oxygen. We're taking in nutrients. But our body is a really big place, and we need to distribute those nutrients and that oxygen to all sorts of places that are really far from the actual organs that are taking them in. If I'm a cell out in your finger, I need oxygen, and I need sugar, and I need protein, and I need all these things, but I'm really far away from the lungs, and I'm really far away from the digestive system. So the circulatory system works to support those other systems and is providing nutrients and oxygen and a variety of other things throughout our body. Overall, the circulatory system is going to supply oxygen and nutrients to our cells throughout our body. It's also going to provide a pipeline for things called hormones, basically chemical signals that are made in one part of the body and act in a different part of the body, so that we can distribute these and coordinate events throughout our body. It also is a way to remove waste. So we're going to be able to take the CO2 that's produced in our cells and bring it to the lungs to get rid of it. We're going to be able to take something called nitrogenous waste. We're going to be able to bring it and get rid of it in our kidneys. So the circulatory system is carrying things back and forth. Now, the circulatory system really is composed of a couple of different things. First of all, we've got the heart that beats and drives blood throughout our body. Now, that blood itself is composed of two components. Blood has what we call cells, which is pretty obvious. And there are two real types of cells that we're going to look at. There are red blood cells, whose primary job is to carry oxygen, and there are white blood cells. Now, the primary job of white blood cells is to function in the immune system and fight infection. And we'll look at those in a great detail when we look at the immune system. There are also things called platelets and a variety of other things that help in clotting and stopping blood from flowing out if we get a cut. In addition to the cellular part of the blood, there's also what we call blood plasma. Now, plasma basically contains everything that's not a cell. The blood plasma has things like dissolved hormones, and it has salts and nutrients and stuff like this that are just kind of floating around in the blood. Now, in addition to the heart and the blood, we've also got the blood vessels, the things that are carrying blood throughout our body. And there are three primary types of blood vessels that we need to be aware of. The first are called arteries. Now, arteries have strong, thick walls, and that form suits their function because the function of arteries is to carry large volumes of blood away from the heart and take it out to the body. There are smaller blood vessels called capillaries. Now, these capillaries serve in different parts of the body like the lungs or the organs or the digestive system. And these very, very small blood vessels, these very, very thin blood vessels that are only one cell thick, they serve as places where the body can put nutrients into the blood or take nutrients out of the blood. Now, the reason that these capillaries are so good at doing this is they let every blood cell be really close to the body. Imagine trying to deliver mail. You're a UPS truck or an Amazon truck or something like that. If you're driving along on the interstate, surrounded by cars on either side of you, you're going to have a really hard time dropping off your package at somebody's house. That would be kind of like being on an artery. There are thousands of blood cells everywhere flying around at high speed. However, it's a lot easier to deliver a package or to pick up a package if you're on a small, narrow road where every car could stop right in front of the house. That would be the equivalent of a capillary. The blood cell is really close to the edge. And so capillaries are perfect for picking up nutrients, for dropping off nutrients, for all of these sorts of jobs that are important at the lungs and the digestive system, and also at the muscles, where we're dropping off things like sugar and oxygen and whatnot. Now, the last type of blood vessel is what's called a vein. Capillaries unite after we drop off nutrients and pick up waste and stuff like that. These capillaries unite and go into what we call veins, which are big structures that bring blood back to the heart. Notice I'm not saying anything about like, oh, this blood is oxygenated or it has oxygen or this blood doesn't. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. veins carry blood to the heart. It's as simple as that. That's the level, that's the truth. What veins are is they're much thinner in terms of their walls than an artery. Now the reason is, after the blood's gone through the capillaries, it's not really under a lot of pressure. It's lost its push from the heart, and it's slowed down because of all the friction with the sides of the capillaries and all this, and so the blood is just flowing along very slowly. In fact, the heart isn't beating strong enough to actually get the blood to flow back all the way to your heart. It requires the action of your muscles. Veins have little one-way valves, and these one-way valves let blood squirt through one direction, but it won't let it flow back in the opposite direction. These one-way valves are a lot like if you put your hands together like this in a little tent. Now, if somebody else took a finger and went like this in between your hands, that finger could go through. But if you tried to go down onto your hands like this, you really couldn't push through. The valves in your veins work in just the same way. Blood can push through when the vein is squeezed by muscles, but blood, when the vein is squeezed by muscles, can't go back. Now, this means that the movement of your muscles in, say, your legs is important for actually returning blood back to your heart. This is one of the reasons that after exercise, your coach might tell you to keep walking, to keep moving, because if you suddenly stop, well, your heart is pounding and pounding and pumping blood away from your heart, but your muscles aren't necessarily returning it at the same rate. So that could lead to all sorts of like lightheadedness or something like that. It's also why if you sit very, very still, you can sometimes have your foot fall asleep, because as you're sitting there, well, you're not moving that much, and you're not helping the blood return all the way to your heart. Instead, it might pool up in your foot, and the fact that the old blood is sitting there pooled up stops new blood from getting there, and your foot falling asleep is actually, well, your foot kind of running out of oxygen and kind of dying. And it's not really like, it's not happy, it's not functioning properly, and so it basically, you don't get any feeling from it, and all of a sudden when it wakes up, that pins and needles feeling that you're getting is sort of basically a pain response of these nerves waking back up and coming online. Now, we've talked a lot about the different blood type, or the different components of the circulatory system, but I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how the heart functions. Now, our basic set of blood flow in humans is what we call a two-loop circulatory system. In some very simple animals, like fish, we have what's called a one-loop circulatory system. In a one-loop circulatory system, blood flows from the heart, and it goes to the gas exchange structures. In a fish, those are gills. So the blood goes to the gills, where it drops off CO2, and it picks up oxygen. And in this diagram, we're showing the blood that is low in oxygen as being blue, and the blood that is high in oxygen as being red. Now, the red blood that's high in oxygen goes from the gills, and it travels, always in a blood vessel, it travels all the way to the body structures, the muscles and whatnot, where it drops off that oxygen and picks up more CO2. And that's why after the capillaries in the muscles, the blood goes back to being blue. Now, it really isn't blue. Blood is maybe different shades of red as it's higher in oxygen or lower in oxygen, but it's always a shade of red or purple or something like that. And that has to do with the fact that the molecule that covers the red blood cells that carries the oxygen is what's called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin at its center has a little molecule of iron. When iron combines with oxygen, it makes iron oxide, rust. Rust has that bright orange color. And so this is what really makes our blood red. Now, that blood that's lost its oxygen travels all the way back to the heart and then gets pumped on back to the gills and so on. Now, what this means is that the blood has to travel in a very long loop. We go all the way from the heart, all the way through the gills, all the way to the muscles, and all the way back to the heart. That means that by the end of this, the blood is barely flowing. And so we get a very, very, very anemic, very slow blood flow. Now, humans have what's called a two-loop circulatory system. In this circulatory system, we give the blood an extra boost in pressure by bringing it back to the heart. So we send the blood to the lungs, where it picks up oxygen, drops off CO2, and then it comes back to the heart. That loop from the heart to the lungs and back to the heart, That's called the pulmonary loop. Pulmonary has to do with lungs and air and stuff like this, having to do with pneumatic or pneumonia and all these words that pulmonary has to do with lungs and air. So once we've gone through the pulmonary loop, now our blood that's all charged up with oxygen, it gets sent out to your body and it travels to the organs and muscles and whatnot, where it drops off all of the oxygen that it's picked up and it picks up more CO2 and then it returns to the heart. This is called the systemic loop. It travels to the body's systems. Now, the fact that we bring this stuff back to the heart for another push lets the blood move much faster. Now, you could think about why this might be an advantage. If the blood is moving around in our bodies faster, it's getting to our muscles faster, and what that means is we might be able to move faster because we can get more oxygen to our muscles. We might be able to move faster because we can get more sugar to our muscles. And this is a big evolutionary advantage. We can move and react in all of this faster than an organism that just has a single loop circulatory system. Now, let's take a look at how the heart itself functions. Now remember, there are these two loops, and what we're going to see is that each side of the heart is really responsible for moving things to one loop or the other. Now the heart has what we call 4 chambers. Each chamber is basically a little room inside the heart. Let's take a look at blood flow coming into the heart and out of the heart. So the first chamber that blood enters when it's coming back from the body is called the right atrium. Now an atrium is a word you might have heard before. An atrium is kind of defined as a formal entryway in a house. There's a mall, or there used to be a mall in Massachusetts called the Atrium Mall because it had this big grand entryway. So that atrium is really an entryway for blood. Now blood flows through veins. Remember, veins bring blood back to the heart. It flows through the 2 biggest veins in the body, the vena cava, the inferior coming from the lower part, and the superior vena cava. These go into the right atrium. Now the right atrium fills up with blood and then contracts, pushing blood through a little valve into the right ventricle. Now the right ventricle is going to be what pushes blood out to the lungs. Remember, this blood needs to pick up oxygen and drop off CO2. So the right ventricle has stronger muscular walls than the right atrium because the right atrium just has to push the blood down to the ventricle. The ventricle has to push the blood all the way over to the lungs. But that's not really that far. If you think about it, your heart is right next to your lungs. So the right ventricle squeezes and pushes blood out, again through a little one-way valve, into what we call the pulmonary artery. Now remember, arteries take blood away from the heart. Pulmonary artery takes blood away from the heart and sends it to the lungs. In the lungs, the blood picks up oxygen, drops off CO2, and now returns through, you guessed it, the pulmonary vein. Veins bring blood back to the heart. So we bring blood back through the pulmonary vein, and this time we come to the left atrium. Now the left atrium collects that blood from the pulmonary vein and then sends it through a one-way valve down into the left ventricle. Now the left ventricle has the strongest and thickest muscular walls we'd see in the heart, and the reason is really simple. The left ventricle has to squeeze and push blood all the way from your heart, all the way to the top of your head, all the way from your heart, all the way down to the bottom of your feet. Imagine a giraffe. The heart, which is in the body, has to squeeze and push blood all the way up to that head that might be literally, 3-4 meters above where the heart is. That's quite a push. So the left ventricle has to have very big, thick walls. Now, this ventricle is constantly contracting every time your heart beats. First we have the atrium contract, then we have the ventricle contract. And timing this heartbeat, this bump, 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 bump of atria contracting, then ventricle contracting, that's very, very important. And it's actually organized by little nodes or nervous structures on the heart that we'll look at in a little bit more detail later on. If you lose that rhythm of heartbeat, it can lead to really inefficient movement of blood. This is one of the reasons that a fibrillation of the heart or a fluttering of the heart could lead to death because we're no longer circulating blood, and then the brain and other structures could die from lack of oxygen. This is why it's important to stop that by basically shocking somebody and resetting them with an emergency defibrillator to stop the heart from fibrillating or fluttering by applying an electrical impulse. Now, one of the other things that oftentimes will happen that might go wrong with the circulatory system is the valves in the heart will sometimes fail to work very efficiently. Remember these one-way valves that might stop the blood from flowing back into the atrium from the ventricle. If that one-way valve doesn't work very well, instead of pumping blood out to the body, well, the blood might pump backwards, and it might cut down on the heart's efficiency. We're not moving blood as efficiently, and for that reason, all of a sudden, maybe we can't supply enough oxygen to our body structures, and all of a sudden, our body might feel tired. We might not get enough oxygen to our brain, and our brain might be forgetful. And very often, this sort of valve failure in the heart is a very common cause of death among older Americans because these valves are working literally once a second for your entire life. And if they start to degrade and work poorly, it could be really, really dangerous. And very often, what we do is we'll actually implant artificial valves in a heart to try to restore that good function. I hope this look at the circulatory system has been helpful. We'll certainly go over it more in future videos and in class. Take care. Have a great day.